Welcome. My name is Emily Bernstein. I'm the Education Outreach Associate for the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. And today we are conducting one of our Holocaust Educator of the Year interviews with Dr. Josh Andy. So the Holocaust Educator of the Year Award is something that the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh does every year to honor new teachers in the field who are having a certain level of experience, but also doing innovative things in the classroom. The Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh primary goal is to connect the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with the injustices of today. Through education efforts, the Holocaust Center seeks to address these injustices and empower individuals to build a more civil and humane society. Our offerings include exhibits in our public gallery, both in person and online, an extensive library and archive, engaging cultural events, internationally renowned speakers, and free and affordable resources for teachers. We also offer a robust collection of virtual opportunities and resources. And for more information, we invite you to go to our website. So what is the Holocaust Educator of the Year? We offer this award, and now this year was the 5th year, and it was created to promote and recognize the importance of Holocaust education. And it's given every year to a Holocaust educator who inspires critical thought and personal growth through the lessons of the Holocaust. The winner of the Holocaust Educator of the Year Award receives $2,000 unrestricted to further Holocaust education in their classes. The school in which the recipient is employed also receives $1,000 to support the teaching of the Holocaust. For more information about the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh, upcoming events and opportunities, as well as the Holocaust Educator of the Year Award for 2022, please go to hcofpgh.org/events. So we're here with Dr. Josh Andy. He won our Holocaust Educator of the Year Award in 2017, our very first awardee. So this is your 10th year of teaching history at Winchester Thurston School, where you specialize in non-US history and you teach a course, Genocide, a Global History on Crimes Against Humanity.
Correct. Yeah.
So for the past 8 years, you've traveled with and worked as a scholar and historian for Classrooms Without Borders. And in that work, you've guided students, teachers, and university educators in Holocaust education. For the past 2 years, Josh has served as a scholar at the Center for Jewish History in New York, contributing to the research project Hear Their Cry, Understanding the Jewish Orphan Experience, which convenes at the Center for Jewish History. As part of his work there, Dr. Josh Andy uses the archives at YIVO to research individual narrative histories from Baranovich, Poland, or modern Belarus. His latest academic article was published in February 2020 in Context. The article, When Ghosts Roam the Streets, Historical Memory in Starachowice. I hope I got that right. Which describes how a Polish town grapples with its own history and the larger historical narratives of the Holocaust. Josh Andy holds a bachelor's with honors from Washington and Jefferson College and a master's and PhD from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Josh, we're so pleased to have you with us today, and we're excited to learn more about you and your approach to Holocaust education. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I enjoy working with the center.
We enjoy having you with us. So can you share a little bit more about your background, both personal and educational, that led you into the field of teaching?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it starts with a really good teacher. I think I had an amazing high school history teacher. He taught us the history, but also taught us how to be students. Taught us how to think critically, how to sort of read a text, with a critical lens and through different ideas of history. And so I always thought that was sort of a really good model of how to be a great, maybe not a great teacher, but this is what great teaching looks like. And I was appreciative of that experience as a freshman, and I had him again as my junior year. And sort of when I was an undergraduate student at Washington and Jefferson College, sort of found the same thing in a few of my teachers, my Russian professor, my professor in history that became my advisor. And they both pushed me, and they were both sort of advocates for my own education and pushing me to different ways of thinking, and have you thought about this? Experiments and the notion of what experimenting with my own writing, experimenting and helping me plan to study abroad, and really just being my advocates in my 4 years at undergraduate, and expanding my horizons on what might be possible with a degree in history. And then once I chose to pursue history and go to graduate school, I had, a really amazing department at the University of Birmingham, the Center for Russian and East European Studies, that brought together not only historians, but political scientists, economists, philosophers, linguists that all study sort of that area past Germany, to include Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and brought together in a sort of an academic research center people that all were passionate about the same area, but maybe different ways of thinking about it in different backgrounds and disciplines. And that allowed me to sort of broaden my thinking as well. Right, as a historian, we could go and listen to the economists think about the economic implications of Russian gas or something like that, and have these experiences that really broadened our knowledge. And then when I came back to the United States, I worked at W&J for a little bit, and then worked at Penn State for a while, and then was lucky, I think, to in those my experiences as a student at W&J, and then also teaching there. Really made me a strong advocate for a liberal arts education. Those small classrooms, the ability to have these sort of intellectual engaging conversations and relationships with teachers and professors. And when the opportunity came to join the faculty at Winchester Thurston, that's what I found. I really value the independent side of independent schools. I have a lot of autonomy and control of my own curriculum, but my students are fascinated. They're intellectually curious. They're studious, and they push me to be a better teacher.
We love working with your students, and they really do reflect what you've said, that they're just so interested and engaged, and that speaks a lot to you as a teacher.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think one of the things that the graduates that I keep in touch with, one of the things that have taken my course on genocide. One of the sort of the events, Winchester has our campus program where we can use Pittsburgh and the environs as our campus and really interact not with the sort of the community, but then also the community institutions and organizations. And time after again, it's those moments in the classroom that really speak to it. They can do any of the critical thinking and the reading, and let's have these broad discussions on how the Nazis came to power. Was it a coup? Was it politics? Was it what would the United States sort of ethically chosen to do sort of at the end of the war? Should we have bombed Auschwitz? What really they look back to are those moments of experiential learning. So when we a couple of years ago, came to the Holocaust Center and looked at the women in the Holocaust exhibit, and they were able to see those individual stories and make connections to sort of the larger themes, that's what they really remember.
That was a beautiful exhibit. I remember that through Yad Vashem.
Yeah.
We enjoyed having your students here. So we know you've been teaching for about 10 years at Winchester Thurston, but how long have you been teaching about the Holocaust, and what really got you started into that realm?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as an academic beginning, I was a Russian historian, and that's sort of the in, right? And so looking at what's occurring in the Soviet Union, not only sort of internally, but certainly by the beginnings of World War II, and what the Holocaust looks like in the Soviet Union and the responses. And my first, I guess, ideas of sort of transitioning as a historian and as an academic to a historian of sort of that space between sort of Hitler and Stalin, that was sort of my avenue into that work. I've spent the last sort of 10 years, 10 years looking at that as a researcher and historian. It was, I guess, the politics and history of memory. And so what post Stalin, he died in 1953, what the politics and the historical remembrance around the events of the Holocaust were in the Soviet Union, and the absence of a narrative that included the Jews. And then once I started at Winchester, and I taught when I was at the University of Birmingham, there was a graduate course that I taught that was for students from around the EU, right? Part of the program that no longer exists because of Brexit, that brought EU students for a year at the University of Birmingham and other British universities, and vice versa. It was a team taught. It was sort of a scope and sequence on European culture and society, and I was asked to teach sort of the history part, and what it meant, what these events like World War II, the Holocaust, the rise of sort of the the far right and left during the 70s, like the Baader-Meinhof gang and things, what these sorts of events did to European culture and identity. And so that was some of my first interactions actually teaching about the Holocaust at that moment. And then coming back to WNJ, I was able to teach like sort of the European survey course that dealt with sort of post-Enlightenment, and that would included sort of a broad survey course that included the Holocaust. The same thing as I came to Winchester Thurston teaching AP European history, but my time at Penn State was really when I started to evolve into really focusing on the Nazism and fascism. And I was teaching an upper level history course called Nazism and Fascism, and looking at the differences, right? So what did both ideologies look like, and where were they dissimilar? And helping students understand that sort of the political history of both of those movements. And when I came to Winchester and able to incorporate it into my AP course, and then I went in 2013 for the first time with Classrooms At Borders on one of their study seminars to Berlin, Dresden, and Prague, and coming back and sort of being inspired that those moments as an experiential learner myself, as a teacher, translating that into a class and having the support from my department chair in the school here, that I could design an entire year-long course that they were willing to give me, just not a semester, but a year-long course on not only the Holocaust, but genocide as a whole, and looking at various different manifestations of crimes against humanity throughout history. And so for the last, since 2015, I've taught that course. 14-15 was the first year for that course. And I've taught it every other year, and now it looks like we're going to have enough enrollment that it's going to happen pretty much every year moving forward, just because it is appreciated and popular with the students, because it sort of forces them into conversations that they want to have, and that it's critical thinking. It's and they see it that it's timely. It's popular because they see the similarities in conversations that are occurring not only in Pittsburgh after the tragedy of the Tree of Life, but other things, that they see the rise of historical forces that as historians we thought were put to rest after the 60s maybe, and we see that we can learn from the past. The historian Tim Snyder, who's at Yale, wrote a book, a couple different books, that he really talks about history. History can warn, but history can also instruct. So what are the warnings we can take from history, and what are the lessons we can learn from others, that we might not repeat those same things?
You come at this with such an interesting breadth of knowledge. I'd be curious if you would be willing to have any book recommendations for our more novice teachers that might be watching this interview. I think you could really offer, just some basic, we can talk about this after, but I think it would be wonderful to glean from your wide variety of knowledge and background in approaching the Holocaust.
Yeah, and that's how I really try to teach. I teach this course like I would have taught one of my sort of upper level courses when I was at WNJ or Penn State. It's designed, I tell my students first thing, really repeat it all year long, but also my syllabus, that this is really designed to be taught and learned through an engaging sort of college seminar style course, where we do a lot of readings, and we engage with different authors, different perspectives, and in every sort of iteration of every case study we have, the Holocaust, Armenia, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, unfortunately the list keeps going, that we really look at those, not only the historical narratives of both perpetrator and bystander and collaborator, but also resistance, those who fought back, what does the historical memory look like, but also those individual narratives. As many of those stories that, learning this material, you become a witness. Mm-hmm. And that it's our responsibility to continue to, as teachers and professors and historians, that continue to teach it to our students. And hopefully, and I've seen this with my own students, that they're willing to continue to tell the stories of the individuals, of what happened, but also, I remember one of my interactions with a scholar from Jerusalem, that she was telling a story of, at some point in time in the 90s, she was in the United States giving a lecture on the Holocaust of Numbers. And And she said that at one point, at her story, in her talk, her public talk in the 90s, the notion of the number is 5 to 6 million. And a survivor came up to her and said, I think you need to be precise, as precise as you can. If it's 6 million, say 6 million. Because if you leave someone out, does that mean you left my family out, my mother? And so that at that point, she said, I really started thinking about, it's 6 million, but it's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and so on. And that's where I really come from when we talk about numbers with my students. We talk about sort of the big picture history at 30,000 feet, but really quickly we get down to individual narratives, individual places, why, we have discussions about why the majority of Jews in Denmark survived versus the majority, over 90% of the Jews of Poland were murdered. Why did over 90% of the Jews of Thessaloniki get murdered at Auschwitz, but there are small villages and towns in the center of Greece where you have 90% of survival rates. So we talk about there's not just one overall narrative. And I tell my students that there's no way that in my lifetime I will understand the complete tragedy of the Holocaust and these individual stories, but we can do our best to understand more and remember. By remembering the stories beyond, sort of the survivors that are taught, Elie, Wiesel, and Frank, that if we can bring many more of their stories to life and to the classroom, their stories will be remembered and we'll be a witness to that history as well.
Yeah, bringing to light the less iconic stories really does teach. It teaches something, while those stories do teach a certain depth, there's something that comes from learning about ordinary people or people who feel more ordinary to the student. And speaking of teaching, we're definitely going to come back to all of that. I really want to hear more, but I'm curious, what do you think when you think of great teaching or a great teacher in terms of what you teach? What do you think of?
I think great teaching, I think great teaching looks like you're modeling it for your students, what it means to be sort of this lifelong learner. And I don't think there's any one way to do that. I think one of the things is great teachers listen to their students, right? And they really sort of see where they are and help guide them to understanding and that critical thinking. That we can, if we model how to think, how to be a student, that leads to sort of that great teaching. I really learned from my students. That's one of the most important things I always take away from traveling with them and either guiding them or learning beside them is that barrier between sort of the teacher and student really breaks down and you're in those moments of learning together. I think we need to great teachers model intellectual and academic rigor and curiosity. That's the one thing I really want my students to have is to, one of my deans that I used to work for, he gave a speech to all the incoming freshmen one year, and it's really stuck with me. He said, I want you to question answers. Right? When you're here at the university, I want you to dive deeper, right? Don't just sort of have this superficial understanding. Prompt your teachers and prompt your professors, prompt your fellow students. Well, what did you mean by that? Why do you think that? And so, having them continuously question answers is important. And I think that's really modeling great teaching, is the push. And teachers sort of never like to see this or hear this from ourselves, but if we don't know, model that it's okay, right? Hey, I'm going to go find that out for you. And I want you to do the same thing. Let's see what we both come up with. And I think that's what great teaching looks like.
It's honest.
Yeah.
I love that answer. Thank you for that.
No problem.
You did touch on this part before, but I'm curious as to what, literature and teaching methods you draw inspiration from to craft your elective. I want to know a little bit more about your approach, maybe a little more depth about this concept of global history and genocide. I'm really curious to hear more about history, commemoration, and memory, how memory plays a role, and the paths of research you help your students navigate.
Yeah. Research is interesting this year because we can't we would typically go to the Carnegie Library and really get, we have a longer block so we can go there and spend time there and spend a couple of days there. So we're really looking at, it's allowing students to build different skills as well. Like, how do you discern sources online? When I built the course, I really looked at trying to cover as much as I could. And so we really I always start the year with a definition of genocide from the students and what that means. And then we look at the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide and what the definition comes out of it, what the sort of the legal definition is. And immediately students are always drawn to what are the holes, like where are the drawbacks to the actual legal definition. And we really follow that through the whole year. So where does, in terms of US policy and international policies around genocide prevention, and where does the convention from 1948 lack sort of teeth? Where does it allow governments to sort of opt out of enforcing it? So what does it, destroying a population in whole or in part? And it leaves ambiguous what a part means. So, it comes back to numbers and things like that. Acts of genocide. I remember in 1994, there's a State Department memo about, we know there are acts of genocide happening in Rwanda, but how many acts of genocide constitute genocide? So that the State Department doesn't have to label it a genocide, forcing the United States to sort of take a position and act. And so we look at sort of these overall theoretical framework of genocide, the stages of genocide, which ends with denial. And then we start really into Armenia. And I ask students with Armenia, the real focus is historical memory and denial, where we look at what happens, but because it's such an ever-present political football when it comes to the United States and Turkish relations today, we really look at why Turkey denies it, what the facts are on the Armenian side that support it, and what these two historical narratives tell us about memory and denial. And a couple of different, we use a lot of articles, historical articles. There's a fantastic article from 2015, I think, in the New Yorker from Raffi Khatchadourian, whose families generations ago were victims, called A Century of Silence. And it follows his family's story, not only about what happened then, but what's happening in the talent they're from, Diyarbakir, over the last 100 years, between not only the Armenians and the Turks, but also the Kurds that were there. And so you really get this sort of big picture of what happened after 1915 during the Armenian genocide, but then also focusing on one family and then tracing it, with 100 years to the commemoration in 2015. We also do, so when I look at the Holocaust, I really try to focus on historical sources and literature. So students will read excerpts from Knight. Most of the students that have went to Winchester in 8th grade have read Knight in its entirety in 8th grade as part of their Holocaust project. But I really bring in a lot of historical sources. So Timothy Snyder's Black Earth History, Holocaust as History and Warning. This year we're using Peter Hayes's Why, Explaining the Holocaust. And I sort of chose that after interacting with Professor Hayes at the classroom. Yep, that's an amazing book. And I've been using it, a lot this year in his last chapter, his conclusion, his prologue. He really looks at the book as, beware the beginnings. That the Holocaust didn't start with Auschwitz. That murder didn't start with the Einsack group in 1941. That it was the little things, that the truth and facts and words mattered in 1933, and that if you can trace that all the way, policy decisions through sort of an iterative process that get us to the notion of mass murder that began the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that leads directly to mechanized killing at Auschwitz. I've used Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. I've used for a couple of years Christopher Browning's Remembering Survival, because it is about Starohavica, and the main sort of oral history source is Howard Chandler. Howard Chandler is a survivor from Wybierznik. Starachowice Wybierznik is now one city. And I've traveled with Howard for the past several summers, 6 or 7 summers now, back to Starachowice, back to his hometown, and met with people that live then, that live now, and talk about what historical memory looks like in the town. Starachowice, Remembering Survival, is about a slave labor camp, a town of Wybierznik and Starachowice, but really about the slave labor camp that springs up there because of the munitions and steel industry that is there in Poland. And it's taken over by the Germans and the Nazis. And the book delves with not just what happened, but remembering this town, remembering that it's not just about the major camps, that there are over 3,000 German camps across the network. And Browning really looks at the sources and what happens to the Nazis, both Nazi officials, Wehrmacht soldiers, and SS officers that participate in the destruction of the Jewish community of Wybierznik in 1942. And he looks at, can there be justice? What does justice look like after the war? When it's a really good book to look at perspective. And there's one trial of the main perpetrator in the 1960s where survivors, the judge is a former Nazi, right? He serves a couple years and then he's released and he's back into the judiciary. So can former Nazis try their own? That's a major question for the Germans in the 1960s and 70s. But the judge basically lets him off because the survivors all have different perspectives. They're looking at what happens with the liquidation of the ghetto in October of 1942 on the market square. And the judge says, well, you're all telling me a different story. And he's absolutely right, because they're all standing on different places of the square, seeing the same thing from their perspective, and their stories match up in terms of this is what's happening. But the judge says, but you're all seeing it from different perspectives, so you're not credible. And that's why the survivors are not believed in the 1960s. And so I've used it a couple years, and I've reverted back to Peter Hayes's book to really hit home of this notion of why. And I think this is the first I've used it in a couple years, and I've reverted back to the importance of anti-Semitism to the centrality of the Holocaust. And I think that Peter Hayes does an amazing job of really focusing on that. Another book that I would really recommend that I use, and most of these books, Peter Hayes's book is the one that I require. Other thing, we're using chapters, or I give them quotes from books and we discuss them. The other one that we really dig deep into in terms of understanding Germany before 1933 is a German historian, Götz Elie, Why the Germans, Why the Jews, a Prehistory of the Holocaust. And he looks at German history and anti-Semitism and how it morphs over time, and why anti-Semitism in Germany is where it is in 1933 that allows the Nazis to be anti-Semitic, but then also why the rest of society sort of goes along with that aspect of, or a majority of society sort of goes along with it or turns a blind eye to that aspect of Nazi ideology. We use Elie Wiesel. I use a lot of Hollywood movies. We will watch Schindler's List through its entirety, and with my own students and with some students I used to take a couple years ago took to Poland. We were able to meet with Moshe Taube a couple different times, and I remember being at Zibigor's apartment with him. We were showing students that were about to go to Poland the movie, and he wouldn't watch it with them. He and I sat at her kitchen table and talked about his experience, talked about his time as a cantor. But he wanted to just have a conversation with. He hadn't seen the movie, and wasn't sort of about to sit down and watch it the first time with students and unsure what his reaction might be. And I remember taking that group, and then last summer, or 2019, I guess not 2020, taking students and pointing out to my students at Schindler's Factory, Moshe's picture that's on the walls, and really being really sad this past year when he passed.
Yeah, it's such a loss, and it's so amazing that you had that experience with him.
Yeah. And that's and one of the reasons when we travel and when I teach my students this notion that they're witnesses now, I really tell my students, and from the ones I continue to talk to and the ones that I teach early, as juniors, and I see them in their senior year, they really take it to heart that they have some responsibility, that they're going to have to tell a story, that they are really the last generation. These students are the last generation that will meet with survivors, that will meet righteous among the nations, and that it's our duty now to remember their stories and to continue to tell them.
It's the truth, It's just, within the next few years, even the next 3 to 5 years, their own siblings may not have the chance. So
Yeah.
It's a special honor, as well as a responsibility. I want to kind of bring it back to your students. How do you feel that, the Holocaust education and that Winchester Thurston is doing as a whole, is adding to your teaching and your students' lives? Do you see a change in your students after they experience your curriculum? Do you see any changes in Winchester's school community?
Yeah, with my own students, I see there's like an awareness, right? And so at a, I don't want to say like a basic level, but the least thing they're doing is just being aware, right? Sort of their radar is up for the speech, the words, the events around the world. So when they look at the news and they see something happening, they're making connections. And they're saying, like, we talked about what happened to the Rwandans in 1994, but look what's happening to the Rohingya, or how does these internment re-education camps that China has, how does it compare to concentration camps or even Japanese internment, right? What are the differences, similarities? Why do we see the same things happening? And for some of my Jewish students that aren't necessarily connected, it asks them, students to come up to me and say, I've asked about my family's history, and some of them say, our families, came before. There's a lot of families in Pittsburgh that was the case, that they came in the 1880s, 1890s, 1920s. But I had one student that remembers talking to her mom and her grandmother, and that the family candlesticks that they always put out on Friday night dinner for Shabbat. And then just simply asking where they came from, and hearing the story for the first time, that this is what my mother, her great grandmother grabbed to pack, right? And so what the notion of what they took with them, and that this family down the generations now to the alum is now at Wake Forest, remembers, right? That's very poignant for her now. She has this connection to the curriculum. I think it changes it. I don't understand, from a historian's perspective, we're sort of taught as historians, like in graduate school, to be unbiased as possible, to be disconnected from our material, so that we don't bring our own emotions or biases to the research. And a good friend of mine, Natalia Alexian, who teaches in New York City, as a professor, how can you not? We talk about how can we not be? When we travel to Poland together, how are you not moved? How are you not moved to emotions in this material? And students, and I'm pretty honest with my students at the beginning of class of what I may experience in the classroom as I read transcripts, or we talk about someone's experience in Auschwitz, standing on the ramp or standing in the barracks, and I've stood in those places. And so students, allow themselves to have that sort of vulnerability. I tell my students that travel with me, that I see in the classroom, you may not respond right away, especially when we travel. You might not. Adults the same way. We all not experience our emotions at the same time. I have a good friend in Jerusalem that the first time he went to Poland, he was fearful of what was going to happen the first time. He sort of guided as a scholar in Poland, so he went early and spent 7 days sort of doing the tour himself and then with the group. And then he said nothing, right? I was okay. And then when he got back to Jerusalem for 7 nights, he had nightmares, right? And then when that 7th night was over, it was That was his sort of experience. Students are just much more aware, and they a different way to look at history too, right? We look at, AP European history, there's some narrative, but it's really sort of these big driving forces and historical ideas. And this forces students to look at the individual, right? What was the individual's actions in history? And so they take that forward. It's still very much as a rigorous history course. I'm forcing them, I want them to write well. I want them to do, competent research. And so that part, it's really, how do you use all these sort of disparate sources from historians, individual narratives to craft the story of history?
Wow. It's just, I'm kind of at a loss for words. It's nice to see that students are not only connecting with history, but they're doing it in a social, emotional way. And that's okay for them. I think one of the things the Holocaust Center is really encouraging teachers, especially now, is that element of teaching, that it's, a safe space to learn, and to learn with your heart. And it's an interesting way. I once heard a teacher say that it was one way that he could discuss the nature of good and evil, and what kind of person they want to be. So it sounds like that's something that really hits home with your teachers, the way you're teaching it. This might be a challenging question right now, but I want to know, how do you connect Holocaust education with current events that are happening now? You say that your students, you're basically teaching them the skills so that they can make those connections, but how do you foster those connections?
Right. And I think, I benefit from students that are inquisitive and sort of ask the questions like, well, and what, it seems like things that are happening, not just in the United States, but in Poland, and Hungary, and Russia, and Germany, that there's this, the rise of, political viewpoints that we thought, went out of fashion in 1945. You have political, right-wing nationalist parties in power in Poland and Hungary that are playing with history as a political tool, and certainly playing with the history of the Holocaust as a political tool. You have the rise of the Alternative for Germany, right? The far right party in Germany. And so students are interested in what historians think about, does history repeat itself? And I always say history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes sometimes. And I asked them to dig deep. So what is history telling you? Right? And so if you think that there are similarities, why do you think that? What in the past is telling you that there are similarities? And so I see, students today in class ask me, in the news this week and last week, they're hearing this notion of the big lie. What does that mean? Where does that come from? And students, we dug into some of Joseph Goebbels' writing. We dove into this particular pieces, excerpts from Mein Kampf that really speak to that. And they asked themselves, is this sort of what we are seeing? And asked them to be critical thinkers of the past and today, to be cautious, to be aware that symbols of the past are on display again, and to understand why this. I'm trying to think about how I want to say this. Why the symbols of the past are represented in the United States. Why you see the Confederate flag, the swastika in Washington, D.C. last week. Why did someone choose to wear a shirt that said Camp Auschwitz, work shall set you free, with a staff written across the back? And why that's a problem? My students see it. And they want to know, the questions they have is, why is it allowed? I have a student that's German-American, right? He's dual citizen. And so we have these conversations about, I remember meeting with a member of the Bundestag in 2013 about this notion that Germany has managed speech, right? You can't, those symbols are illegal in Germany. And so why aren't they here? Why is that included in free speech? And we talk about the notion of free speech and versus you have the freedom to do those things. I may not agree with it, but you're also going to have to face the consequences of your speech. You have every right to do those things, but you have every right to expect consequences as well. I remember I was in graduate school. My first my first introduction to David Irving, the Holocaust denier, was through the British press. I was in graduate school, and in 2005, David Irving, this was maybe right after the trial with Deborah Lipstadt, he was already warned about traveling in Austria and saying certain things in Austria, and he was going in 2005 to a deniers academic conference in Italy, and he chose to specifically drive through Austria, stop and make a little speech to challenge the Austrian laws around denial, around Nazi symbols, and he was arrested and for basically deemed persona non grata, I think, for the rest of his life in Austria because of those laws. There are ways in which we, as historians, we deal with this, right? So, facts and truth matter to historians. And I ask my students, when you hear things that sort of like, is that true? Right? Show me the evidence. Or again, question those answers. Question what you're being told. If you hear things that you're not so sure about, or if you think are fabrications, falsehoods, ask the person or ask the sources, is this true? Can I verify it? Show me the evidence. I tell my students, as my own sort of personal belief as a historian, we don't make comparisons to the Holocaust. That doesn't mean we don't make comparisons to the early 20s and 30s. That as a historian, I can draw parallels to what is happening in the developed world, in Europe, to the rise of, if you look at economic inequality after 2008, the financial recession, and the rise of far-right nationalist, xenophobic, openly anti-Semitic parties, such as Golden Dawn in Greece. Historically, it tracks right with the economy going the other way, which is exactly what we saw in 2000, after 2008. Anti-Semitism and hatreds like that based on fear are based on, they're not ambiguous. They're based on falsehoods and the notion that something is changing and I can't explain it, not me as an historian, but the notion that someone who believes it doesn't want to understand, doesn't want to explain, and it's easier to place blame. Mm-hmm. Anti-Semitism itself, there's no basis. There's no basis for any of the anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes throughout history. There are reasons they start where they are. We can point to most of them in historical resources, but they're all based on the unknown, right? There's something fearful changing. We can't explain it, so we look to blame. And there's nothing rational. Hatred and anti-Semitism are based on race are completely irrational.
And yet it makes it one of the most versatile types of hatred.
Correct. Yep.
Maybe even for that reason.
Yeah.
I think that this is going to touch a little bit more on what you've already said, but I'll give you the chance to maybe add something. Following up on this question about connecting, Holocaust education with current events, recent events in our country have been quite heavy, including but not limited to the COVID-19 pandemic, nationwide riots against police brutality and systemic racism, and violence precipitated by the current political divide. I'm assuming you do think there are lessons that can be taken from the Holocaust to grapple with these difficult topics. If so, right, what are your thoughts right now as a teacher, and especially in the context of how you're discussing it with your students.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, back in March and April, as the coronavirus sort of spiked the first time, whether because of the virus itself or the lockdowns, this notion of blame came out. And I remember, unfortunately, all of the very anti-Semitic posters in Ohio and elsewhere that were brought up. Old tropes, old stereotypes, old depictions, old school cartoons that are straight out of the 1930s, all came out. And I think, one of the things I engage with my students is this new to the United States? And allow them and ask those probing questions to them. That, are we in something different right now? And as they look back in U.S. history, one of the things that they can find is there's always been this undercurrent of anti-Semitism in U.S. society that rears its ugly head in times like this. Whether it was after the beginnings of the Depression, you can look at the 1920s and Father Coughlin on his radio show, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh. There was this notion of placing blame somewhere for the woes of the United States. But I also said, there are, this summer, students asked me that when we were looking at articles coming out about, students engaging with Anne Frank as a way to sort of grapple with being locked down and being home and asking me, well, is this appropriate? I said, well, you don't have to say like it's not the same situation, right? You're locked down because you want to help yourself and your family. She's locked down. Anne Frank is locked down because she's trying to save her life and her family's life. They're completely different situations. But you can look at as a young girl, as a young student today, how do you manage it? How do you sort of go about some daily things and keeping that sort of this notion of, I remember a couple years ago, the year I won the award, I talked at the Waldman about this notion of spiritual resistance. How do you keep your humanity? How do you keep that side of you? And it was, it's the little things, right? So the boys in Prague and Terezin who wrote Vadim, right? Keeping the newspaper under the watchful gaze without the watchful gaze of the SS, seeing it. The Verdi's Requiem at Terezin. The work of the Oneg Shabbos and the historians and people in the Warsaw Ghetto. Those are the types of stories we can look to and say, in difficult times that have no comparison to what Europe experienced in the 1940s, but what might we be able to take from it? A couple weeks ago, I got to meet for the first time Natan Sharansky, the refusenik from the Soviet Union, who finally got free in 1987. And he said he has a new book out about Never Alone, about a conversation between his, the Jewish people and him. But he said on this sort of virtual Zoom book tour, since the book has come out, he said, people are always asking me, you were in solitary confinement for all those years. What lessons could we learn from you about lockdowns and coronavirus? It's not the same, but you build your world, right? You sort of keep your sanity by keeping your world. And so he talked about imagining what it was going to be like to be a free Jew in Israel once he got out of the Soviet Union. And he said once he got there, it wasn't, his dream, what he envisioned in his world, and he didn't know really anything about Judaism to an extent that he needed to because of the Soviet Union. But there are lessons to be taken in that respect. And he talked about it when we were on Zoom together about, you keep those pieces of yourself that keep your humanity, keep your spirituality, and continue to keep those connections. It's easier today with Zoom, but and I think, and with the current political climate, we also look to those who spoke up, right? And we look at the one, in Munich, there was the journalist Fritz Gerlich, who spoke out through his newspaper. He was editor of one of the newspapers in Munich throughout the 20s, and was, as a journalist, one of the first who sort of put up the red radar of the red siren of, Hitler is not what we think he is. He's going to, there's something wrong here. And in February of 33, he was arrested. And the night of the Long Knives, Fritz Gerlich was murdered at Dachau as part of the crackdown on the SA, but also political opponents of Hitler. But throughout the 20s, before the beer hall putsch and after, Fritz Gerlich was kept he was a conservative on the center right, but kept his convictions. How do you keep your convictions in times like this? When you see people, the one thing the fascists and the Nazis did was they themselves decided that who was part of the nation, who's in, who's out, who gets to be called a German, who gets to be called an Italian. And so are we seeing the same in other places today? Are we seeing politicians say, well, here's who gets the full rights as an American or a German or a Brit? And so are there similarities in that respect? Are politicians around the world playing sort of fast and loose with truth and fact? Those are the two things that, we need to hold on to. Facts matter, words matter. And these are the warnings from history.
Indeed, they are.
Yeah.
So, what are some challenges that, given all this, what are some challenges that you have faced in teaching about the Holocaust? And what's some advice you would give to an educator who will be teaching about the Holocaust for the first time?
I haven't had many difficulties. I think the one difficulty I have is the sheer amount of source material, right? So for me, every year, I teach this year-long course. The Holocaust is the longest unit. I always wanted to go more. I'm always learning something, right? A source I choose, something, a question a student raises that I need to dig deeper for. But so where do you stop? How much do you cover every year? How deep do you want to go? One of the difficulties I have as an educator is I teach for the Jewish education program at RODEF, and I teach juniors and seniors. I've taught university students, and this is 6th and 7th graders. And so, what do I hold back? How much do I believe 6th and 7th graders can handle some of it, but how much shouldn't they know at that age? Right? So I guess what's the appropriate age for the education, Holocaust education? I know Yad Vashem has a specific age that you're not really basically allowed to see some stuff. We don't have it in the United States. I have friends that say you should be in high school. I don't necessarily take that, but I think the one thing I do is you tailor, as a teacher, I would say you tailor that education to the audience, right? So some of that is sort of age appropriate, but then also, this year I have more women in the class. And so I'm speaking more to that experience. When I teach at RODEF and at 6th and 7th graders, I really speak to the experience of that age group through the Holocaust. So I speak more to the 1.1 million Jewish kids who were murdered by the Nazis and what they were experiencing and their testimonies. And so Anne Frank and other diaries that we can learn from. And I tell all my students, when we meet survivors, right? How Howard Chandler came to my class through Zoom this year. He's 90. He just turned 92, which means he was younger than you when this started. So there's this cognitive dissonance of this gentle sort of grandfatherly old man in front of us. And I have this every time I'm sitting with him in Poland at the cafe and we're having conversations and I'm asking him sort of more probing questions. He experienced this, he's turning 11 right after the war starts. And my students are 17 and 18. And so having the understanding that, get them in that mindset that the person in front of you experienced this when they were mostly younger than you. And so what did that mean for them? Sit back and listen. And vary. I think there are amazing resources. as teachers, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Between the Holocaust Center, Classrooms at Borders, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in DC, Facing History in Ourselves, the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation, there are amazing organizations out there that will build a foundation for you, support you, already have a lot of curriculum out there for you. So just reach out to them. Everybody I've ever worked with, from you, Emily, and Lauren, to friends at the museum in DC, to the Jewish Partisan Education Foundation, right? They are more than willing to help guide us. So just sort of lean on them. And lean on each other, right? I work with friends at Alderdice that are looking for sources, and we sort of bounce each other ideas off the other. One of my best friends I met through Classrooms at Borders, and we've really developed a rapport. We call each other in the mornings on our drive to work, 2 or 3 times a week, and talk about these things, right? The education and what's happening in the world. We build a community.
It's so important to have a community and to have friends in this field. It's a difficult field to be in, but it's very rewarding in a sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And I have to say, this has been one of the most meaningful interviews that I've ever had with a teacher. Thank you so much, Josh. And I want to give you an opportunity to share with us. Do you have anything else you would like to share with us in terms of, what you're working on, or what your hopes are this coming year with your students?
I think we're all in survival mode this year. We're back sort of hybrid, so we got half my class every other week. So I'm unmasked in my office with the door shut, with the windows open. I open the window, put mask back on. This year is do what we need to do. Really, the content has been scaled back, but the powerful things are forward. I want to make sure my students, have what they need this year. I'm working on, we shut down on March 13th. About a week and a half before that, I was in New York at the Center for Jewish History for one of our last in-person meetings, working the archives that Friday. And so I miss that sort of academic aspect of my life right now. I can't get to New York. I can't get in the archives. I'm working on expanding my work on Howard Chandler's story to the rest of Poland. I've got a longer article. That article came out from sort of a longer piece, about 15,000 words, that had to be cut down to about 3,000. So the bulk of that work still needs to sort of get back into the written piece. And I'm actually working on Rigor, who's the director of Classrooms at Borders, looking at her mom's story. So her mom in the 90s wrote down her story of survival from Baranovich in what is Belarus. What is Belarus today? What was Poland? She fought with the partisans. She was saved by a righteous Gentile from the Baranovich ghetto. And she wrote it down. And I'm going back through not only the English and sort of rewriting parts of it, but I'm adding a lot of sort of explanatory historical footnotes, the things that we know now. Mm-hmm. I'm working with Father Patrick Dubois' organization in France, and looking at they've done a lot of work in Baranovich, and looking at Rachel, Zippy's mother, writes about we know that the Jews of the time were taken to these places. We don't know where they were taken, but we do now. So I'm adding all this. I'm adding some of the history of her life. She went to Bas Yakov school in Krakow, and so we know more about these experiences. So I'm adding to it, and I'm interviewing Zippy about how she learned of her mother's story, right? Because there were times where she wouldn't speak about it. And so growing up as a second generation survivor, and what it means to be second generation. I remember Zippy always telling me that, the roles are reversed, that her parents would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and having nightmares. And it was the children's turn to sort of calm the parents. And so I'm writing up not only her mother's memoirs, but also her story, and trying to put it together in an article or a short pamphlet.
This is also amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Andy, for being with us today, for sharing your wisdom, and your experience, and what it's really like for you and your students. I think that just participating in this interview today is really going to help a lot of our teachers during a very difficult year. Like Josh said, please feel free to lean on us. Lean on all of the resources that are available to you. And below this video, I'm going to post not only Dr. Andy's book recommendations, but also all the resources that are local to you to lean on and draw inspiration from, as well as those nationally, because we're a network, really. So if you're also, to speak about generations, the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh has a generations group. So if you are the child or grandchild of a Holocaust survivor and you would like to meet with other people like you and to have special opportunities for learning and discussion, please visit our website and visit our Generation Speakers series. And for all other types of opportunities, please sign up for our mailing list, because we have so many different virtual opportunities happening right now for teachers, for students, and for community members, especially our new virtual field trips. So thank you again, Dr. Andy, and I look forward to meeting with you again soon, hopefully in person.
Thanks, Elie.